Before this episode begins, let's take a moment to speak of Jazz Journalists Association activities. 8 nominees for our 2025 Book of the Year Awards and 15 honorable mentions are posted at jjanews.org, along with other articles from our international membership. And we urge you to take a look at the Jazz Omnibus, the 600-page anthology of 21st century photos and writings by members of the Jazz Journalists Association, available online and wherever books are sold. And now, on with the show.
Hello and welcome to The Buzz, the podcast of the Jazz Journalists Association, an international professional organization of writers, photographers, and broadcasters focused on jazz. I'm Michael Ambrosino, JJA member and host for a discussion with Tomas Peña and José Massó as we explore the topic of bilingualism in jazz journalism. Tomas Peña is a veteran journalist whose work has been featured in All About Jazz, the Latin Jazz Corner, Chamber Music America magazine, and the JJA's latest anthology, the Jazz Omnibus. After several years with the Latin Jazz Network, he created jazzlapeña.com, which focuses on the vibrant New York City music scene. In 2017, he founded the Puerto Rican Project that celebrates Boricua pioneers that have radically shaped the legacy of Latin music and jazz around the world. José Massó is an educator, community activist, and pioneer host of Con Salsa, the internationally renowned Latin music broadcast on WBUR in Boston, Massachusetts. Con Salsa will be celebrating its 50th anniversary next year. In 2014, Massó was inducted into the Massachusetts Broadcasters Hall of Fame, and in 2021 became one of the JJA's Jazz Heroes for his continued work sharing the rich tradition of Afro-Latin music with his English and Spanish-speaking listeners. Gentlemen, welcome to The Buzz.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Thank you.
So glad to have you on this topic. I think we all agree that it's long in coming that we have a conversation about it. So just to get into it, I'm curious, when did you start your journeys as bilingual jazz journalists? And was there a particular imperative that was an important catalyst to the start of your work?
Okay, so I started writing for Latin Jazz Network, and I wrote for Latin Jazz Network from 2000 to about 2014. And during that time, I encountered many musicians whose preferred language was Spanish, and I basically interpreted because it was an all English website. But I did struggle with the language because I was not using it that much. Later on, when I founded Jazz de la Peña, I started to cover the New York scene and eventually expanded out to the Puerto Rico music scene after I started the Puerto Rico project. In 2017, when Hurricane Maria devastated the island and the music community, I felt an imperative to improve my Spanish, learn to read, write, translate, and speak to my Boricua brothers in their language. And at that time, they were going through a really terrible time. And also during that time, I was in and out of the island. I was immersing myself in the culture. I was raiding the bookstores, buying a lot of books in Spanish, which unfortunately never make it to this side in English. There's so much information on that side that never really gets translated onto this side, but that's another topic. But anyway, I just felt an imperative to do that. And in 2022 was when I founded the Puerto Rico project. And in 2024, Jazz de la Peña went completely bilingual. So it hasn't been that long, but it definitely has. I've seen a big difference in how people respond to me now that I'm actually publishing it in both languages. It really opened a lot of doors in terms of being able to work with people on the island, and for those who didn't who preferred to speak in Spanish, it became a lot easier for me to work with them and translate their work into English and Spanish when I presented it.
Now, Jose, I mean, you're celebrating 50 years. So when I think back to 1975, was there a moment where you had some type of feeling that this was your destiny in terms of combining English and Spanish as you report on jazz and Latin music?
prior to beginning the program on June 22nd, 1975, I was a bilingual teacher here in the Boston Public Schools. I had taught since 1973, but to put things in context, 1973, we had the Vietnam War, we had student unrest on college campuses, we had Women's Lib, we had Cesar Chavez and the farm workers, we had the Civil Rights Movement, we had the Black Panthers, we had Stokely Carmichael, we had the Young Lords, we had the fight for independence in Puerto Rico. I had transferred from University of Puerto Rico to Antioch College in 1970 and found that most Americans knew very little about their fellow American citizens from the archipelago of Puerto Rico that we knew about them. And so consequently, I knew that somewhere, sometime, someplace, I would have to serve as a bridge between cultures, between nationalities, ethnicities, languages, in a way of connecting people. And as a teacher in bilingual ed, I used film to start off my first year. I used video the second year, and then I used my extensive record collection as part of the pedagogy that I taught every single day in the classroom. My students urged me to get out of the classroom and to use media, whatever form of media I could use to connect with a broader audience. And so 1973, it was also the beginning of busing here in the city of Boston, which meant that there was some conflict between the status quo, which for most of the time were white Americans living in the communities of white folks in the city of Boston, vis-a-vis Black Americans who were trying to integrate the schools. And so therefore, I thought it was imperative for me to have a voice and a platform. And when the opportunity came on June 22nd to start a program, I quickly said, I want to do a program that's going to be bilingual because I'd been a bilingual teacher. And I thought it was important that I uplift and amplify the ability of Spanish-speaking folks to hear their own language, not on a commercial AM dial, but on a non-commercial, NPR dial. And second, I wanted non-Spanish speakers to hear someone who is a Spanish speaker, a native Spanish speaker, speaking both languages, both English and Spanish. And I also wanted to quickly use the music as the connector. And I stated from the beginning, look, the program is going to feature Afro-Latin music and jazz, and you're going to hear some R&B and things of that nature, because it's going to connect us and really emphasize and amplify the Afro-descendancy of those of us who come from the Caribbean, Latin America, and the connection with Afro-descendants here in the United States. So I think the catalyst was all those things together. The opportunity then to do a radio program was the ultimate opportunity to be able to share these things in a way that I had a wider audience and a bigger platform.
And I remember being in Boston as a young man in 1981. I used to listen to Con Salsa and Eric in the Evening, my two best shows. Tomas, you've been really, really passionate and articulate about how leaning into Spanish has kind of deepened your journalism. Can you kind of describe that as you really got serious about writing and researching and speaking in Spanish? How did it deepen your understanding of the art, culture, and music you were reporting on?
Yeah, so without doing that, I don't think I would have gotten to the point where I am today. Of course, I just want to go back and put some context. I mean, I was a Spanish speaker before I was an English speaker because I was raised by a woman who didn't speak English. But later on, because I became Americanized and I'm living in America, Brooklyn, many different cultures, English was the primary language. But in terms of bilingualism, specifically in the area of like covering Puerto Rico, I found that it really opened a lot of doors for me in terms of gaining respect from my fellow Puerto Ricans. A lot of people that there's been a lot of. There's a funny thing about Puerto Rico. If you don't live there and you don't really understand what life is like there, it's very difficult to penetrate that bubble. But in terms of journalism, if you go in prepared, if you go in respectful, if you go in humble, and if you go in speaking their language, doors open. The task is never easy, but it makes it a lot. When you gain the trust of the people that you're reporting on, it really enhances the relationships. And I'm proud to say that recently I received an email from a writer in Puerto Rico, and he used the word colleague. And to me, that when somebody calls you a colleague, that says it all. Because Puerto Rico's colonial status, they have feelings about what's going on here. So if you're coming from here, going there, and they need to know in a sense that you understand the culture, that you respect the culture, and that you are going to report on the culture or whoever you're interviewing in a fair and honest way. And knowing the language also gives you that edge in terms of the nuances of the language, the nuances of the culture, And as a child, I visited Puerto Rico. I used to spend my summers in Puerto Rico. As an adult, later on, I haven't spent as much time. I visit maybe once a year. But once you go there, it all comes back. It's really been an incredible journey in terms of fulfilling not only an obligation to the journalism, but also an obligation to. I feel like it's a nod to my family, my ancestry, the island, and I hate to say it, but it's absolutely true. Puerto Rico does not get a lot of attention when it comes to if you talk about Cuba and you talk about Puerto Rico and you say Cuba, you get one reaction. If you say about Puerto Rico, you get a different reaction. The immense amount of talent on that island doesn't often get the attention it deserves, and so I really felt like I wanted to concentrate in that area for that reason.
Jose, I've had the pleasure of not just listening to your radio show for decades, he says, dating himself, but I've also had the pleasure and the honor of actually seeing you live. And I think there's something about the way that you present yourself in concerts as an MC, as a steward of this culture, or in community events, where when you're speaking in English and Spanish, and we've talked about this, you're bridging communities. Can you speak to that in terms of how that's been such a vital component of your career?
Well, sure. I mean, I think, very early on, I mean, I was raised in Puerto Rico. I was born in Puerto Rico, raised in Puerto Rico. As I've said, I came to the United States when I was 20 years old, even though I had learned English when I was in Japan, because like many other Puerto Ricans of my father's generation, he joined the United States Army for World War II. And so thus he was an Army officer by the time I retired. And one of his assignments was to Japan, where I came with the family, and I was only 6 years old, and I learned how to speak English. And then when I went back to Puerto Rico, of course, I continued with the Spanish and the English in the classroom. But I always felt that if there was a gift that I had was my ability to speak both languages, but also not only to speak both languages, to be multicultural. And I say multicultural because living in Japan expanded my cultural understanding beyond just the paradigm of North America, Caribbean. It was the world, right? Japan was another world and therefore another culture, which I had to adapt to and learn of, which opened my mind to the world and my role as a citizen of the world. And so therefore, having this gift to communicate in both languages was always amplified, not only within my family, but the community at school, in every place I worked. And thus, when I came to the United States, as I've stated before, finding to my amazement that few Americans knew about the history of Latin America, let alone Puerto Rico, that I needed to bridge that lack of information and be an educator. That's why I wound up in the classroom. But then I found out that by using media, I could then use that way of amplifying this history, connecting folks to understand the traditions, the culture, but also understand the dynamics between the United States and Latin America, Caribbean, and the history since 1898, and going to Tomas's point of view, that Puerto Rico has been a colony under Spain and then that of the United States. And since my work wasn't just in radio, it opened my opportunities to do television, and then it opened my opportunities to continue activism in the community. And that activism then meant that I needed to use my voice as a way of galvanizing communities in some proactive motion, and so that they would do something that would change the paradigm, change the status quo to benefit our community of color that was being marginalized. And that gave me the opportunity to work in government. I worked in the governor's office as a Hispanic liaison, director of community services. It gave me the opportunity to work in the private sector as a sports agent representing Latino baseball players. It gave me the opportunity to work in academia at Northeastern University. It gave me an opportunity to work in philanthropy in other areas where every single place I went, the ability to speak both languages was the entree for me to connect with all of these communities in a way that they felt that they were being included, not excluded. And the entities that hired me wanted me to use that as the bridge. They knew that that was an asset by having me as being part of their organization. And they said, he's going to be the one that's going to connect these collective people in ways that they will become one instead of being disparate and apart. And so for me, being able to use this voice and platform both in public, in gatherings, in meetings, in small, living rooms, wherever it would be, where I could connect with people in their own language, being multicultural in the ability to, switch cultural channels so that they understood and I understood them. I knew, enough about language to know that there is both the spoken language, but there's a nonverbal language as well. And that made it possible for me to connect with folks, that they understood that I was just speaking it, that I was living it. And it's become an asset for me in all of my career and all throughout my life for the last 50 years. So I think bilingualism has been very much part of why I've been successful in everything I've done. But it's also been successful on those who have embraced the idea of bilingualism being an asset instead of being a negative. And I think those organizations that I mentioned, just a few of the ones that I've worked with, understood that and have understood that as they continue forward in the work that they've done, that you need to have the ability to communicate with everyone. And again, it's not just bilingualism, it's multiculturalism, it's understanding language, it's understanding culture, it's understanding those little things that you won't understand just by what somebody's telling you, it's how they're telling you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, it's an important part of all the work I've done.
Before we get into the cultural realities of your work, I have one last question that has to do with who you are as creative people. We look at journalists as being objective people who report on culture, but so much of what you both do has to do with your personal identity and your creative compass, the way that you wish to sort of attack issues or actually be as metaphorical or lyrical as the musicians that you're actually dealing with on a regular basis. So, Tomas, when it comes to being bilingual, how has it shaped the intimate quality of who you are as an artist, reporting on musicians and other artists?
It really has, so like I said, since I spent so many years writing in English, and now this is just since 2024 that I actually switched over to a bilingual format. It was the catalyst that just sort of opened up everything to me that I wasn't able to do before. Identity wise, I've always, I consider myself, Puerto Rican above anything else. And I've always felt that way since I was a child. And because I spent a lot of time in Puerto Rico when I was as a child, the identity was always there. It's been funny because in journalism, sometimes you kind of feel like the oddball, because I've had situations where, for example, I wanted to write an article about a John Coltrane, and I asked a publicist, I'd like to write about an article about John Coltrane. And the response that I got was, well, you're the Latino guy. What do you know about John Coltrane? It was an insult, and I said, well, try me. Long story short, when I submitted the work, the guy was shocked, which is even more insulting, that he would be insulted by the fact that I was not writing about something that was a Latino issue or Latino music. But on the other hand, it really has allowed me to expand on my identity, to be who I am, to feel free to be able to write in either language, and to be able to communicate with my readers in both languages. I was actually surprised when I learned that I'm one of the few that's doing it. I really was amazed by that, because sometimes when you're buried in the work with your head down, you don't really pay attention to what other people are doing. It's other people who come to me and say, well, there's not too many people doing what you're doing. One of the reasons that I can do it is because I've always remained independent. When I decided to do it, I just did it. I didn't have to go ask permission to do it. I was able to act on my passion and what I wanted to do when I wanted to do it. So yeah, I mean, it's always, being bilingual has always been part of my identity, but being a bilingual journalist is another dimension of being able to express yourself through your work in the both languages that you're comfortable with. It has yielded incredible results.
One of the things I explored in Los Olvidados, my audio documentary on Pan-Latin artistry and the discrimination that those artists have faced, is this idea of code switching. And when I think of code switching, I think of Ray Barretto in the artistic way, in which
absolutely.
Ray could play 7 different genres within the same song, regardless of their time signatures or the nuance, and he did them all with the authentic flair of a genius. And when I think of broadcasting, that's when I think of José Massó. Because Jose, you code switch in communities, you code switch on the air, but you do it so effortlessly that you exemplify the bilingual relationship with multiculturalism. When I say code switching to you as it relates to your life, I understand that. But when it relates to what you do professionally, unpack that for us.
Well, I mean, it starts with the idea that I'm very secure with my identity, right? So, similar to Tomas, having been born in Puerto Rico, I know I'm Puerto Rican. Coming from a very proud family of Afro descendants, I know that my race is black, but my ethnicity is Afro-Puerto Rican. Um, Knowing that I'm born in Puerto Rico, I'm part of the United States as a citizen, so my citizenship is that of the United States. So you combine all that, I'm very clear as to who I am and my identity. But my identity goes much further than that, right? Because it goes to the idea of my experiences, my lived experiences that include the fact that I'm multilingual and bicultural and bicultural and bilingual and multicultural as well. And so I think that part of that code switching is that I have found that as I have navigated life, and I learned this from my father, Michael, because my father was the type of person, regardless of whatever rank in life he had, he was able to communicate with just about everyone. When I was in high school, I had a band at the time, and he would show up for the school dances. I would see him in the back speaking with the janitor, and then at night when I'd go home, we'd have conversations. And he'd tell me all these conversations he had with the janitor. And so I learned from my dad that the ability to speak to everyone, regardless of their social status, regardless of where they came from, was an important element of being able to communicate. So in my mind, what I learned from my father is to first and foremost be a communicator, be able to communicate with people, regardless of they're the ones serving you the coffee on the other side of the coffee shop, or they're the ones on the other side of the table in a corporate meeting. So that code switching is comfortable for me because I can go through 10 different people in 10 different minutes, and I can communicate with each and every one of them, feel very comfortable in my communication, and they feel very comfortable in me communicating with them and then communicating with me. They don't feel like this guy's putting on some air and he's being phony about it, because that's who he is, because I'm more than just that one person. I'm all of the above, right? And I think that goes back to feeling comfortable about who I am. So I don't feel like I'm playing a game or I'm gaming somebody else. When I do that, I'm just feeling that I'm very natural in that ambiance with that person and communicating with them the way I can communicate, and they can communicate back with me with respect, with who they are and what they bring to the table. And then the other piece, I think is important, is that to the point of being able to do what I do, who you hear on the radio is the same person you're going to see in the street, the same person you're going to see on the stage, the same person who's going to be in a community meeting, et cetera, et cetera. My purpose in life, I went to Antioch College, and the motto at Antioch College was to always challenge the status quo and be ashamed to die until you have achieved the victory for humanity. Not that I'm carrying a lot of weight on my shoulders, but I understood what that meant was that you had to continuously be working to better the situation for everyone, in particular folks who are marginalized and no voices. And so my radio program and everything I've done, even though music in the radio program is the connector, the glue, the epicenter of everything I do, and spoken word as well, it is clearly with a purpose of uniting people, affirming our Afro-descendancy, making people proud of who they are, but understanding that we're stronger together, and that what makes us strong is our unity, and that's where our power comes in, because we're a diverse community. And at the same time, that musicians, the living angels, as I speak of them, are the ones through their art and their music are the chroniclers of our life, regardless if it's a jazz artist, an R&B artist, or Latin artist. They chronicle our life through what they basically put out in their product, right? And so I think I'm just the connector. I'm just the bridge that brings what they do to the audience, and then therefore expose the audience to all this richness of these living angels. And so if you're a Latino listening to my show, yes, you're going to hear, a gran combo de Puerto Rico, but at the same time, you hear Miguel Senón, but yes, at the same time, you're going to hear, maybe the Temptations of Stevie Wonder. It depends on what the theme is for that particular moment in time. And so I think the ability to use all of these levers as a way of communicating with people, for me, is utmost important, and particularly because the end game is to connect people to see that they're stronger together, and not to divide us based on race, ethnicity, nationality, language, religion, or whatever people may think is what separates us.
Well, I know for a fact, having talked to you both in preparation for this podcast, that you'd both fit into my Italian family reunion just fine, as long as you bone up on your bocce. That's it. Especially Tomas, especially you. We share those Brooklyn roots.
Yeah.
So, Tomas, you made me think of something really interesting in a prior conversation. You said something like, when Spanish is not enough, and you have a quote that says, entering a situation unprepared or disrespectfully is problematic, even with language proficiency. Can you unpack that? When you speak Spanish fluently, but there's more to it in terms of the community you're engaging, What goes into respecting that community and moving past simply being fluent in a language that you share with them?
So, as you know, I love to do my homework. So, before I was actually, at the time when I was writing for Latin Jazz Network, I was very involved with the Cuban community when the Jazz Gallery opened some years ago. From 2000 to about 2010, I was lucky enough to be able to witness Miguel Zenon, Daphne Prieto, Yosvani Terry, his brother, and a number of other Cuban musicians who had just come in from Cuba, and they were cutting their teeth and learning, and honing their trade at the Jazz Gallery, which was, I don't know if you know anything about the Jazz Gallery, but it was basically featuring emerging musicians, giving them opportunities to rehearse for very low rates and to be able to present their work, to be able to present their compositions in front of a live audience, all of that. It was a very small room. It was a very intimate atmosphere. And I was interacting with these guys. It was, and it was an incredible experience because I connected with these guys on a very deep level because they saw how passionate I was about their work. They saw how interested I was in learning about every aspect of their lives, their careers. In some cases, I was like one of the first guys to interview some of these people before they blew up. Like before Miguel Zenon blew up, he was one of the guys that you see at the Jazz Gallery every Friday and Saturday working on his material. I think it's the passion that you show, the fact that you're able to, the curiosity that you have about what they're doing, the respect for what they're doing, going in prepared, and then as a journalist, when you produce a product, having to do with whoever it was. Like for example, I spent quite a bit of time with the drummer Daphne Prieto. Right after the New York Times put out an article about him, I spent some time with him, and I did an article on him as well. And I got to know his family. I got to know, and it's you're immersed, and once you're immersed in that world, and they get to know you, you get to know them. It becomes a very natural relationship. And the same thing with when I started covering Puerto Rico. Even though I wasn't born in Puerto Rico, when I went there, I made it my business to seek out, Humberto Ramirez, William Cepeda, Charlie Sepulveda. When they come to New York, sometimes they stay at my house. They saw the passion that I had for their music and how much I wanted to learn about it, how concerned I was about reporting on it accurately, being prepared and understanding what they were doing. And then when we became friends, not friends, I wouldn't say close friends, but friendly enough, that curtain again, it dropped, and then you're just communicating, and you've gone on to another level of communication, and it becomes very natural, and so does the reporting.
I so appreciate you saying that because there is a way in which musicians can relate to journalists in a very performative way.
Yes.
And often that means that they're inside a shell of what they think the industry requires them to say. Both of you do a brilliant job of breaking down those walls with compassion, curiosity, and creativity to bring the true artistic voice out that is the most pleasurable and educational and informative way that someone can understand what that artist is doing. Jose, you do something that I think is brilliant, which is you embody a pan-Latin theology because you are the minister of Consalsa. and you've really influenced me because you said you can't presume that everyone listening to your show, that you can't presume that people understand the specific histories of the Latin cultures that your music and reporting represents.
Yeah, I mean, you can. And so part of it is I start from the thinking that African proverb that says, until the lion told the story of the hunt, the hunter will always be glorified, which to me means that there's been a history, and both music is part of it, which has been taught and promoted for centuries and generations, that starts off from a very Eurocentric point of view of what that history is, not understanding that the history is much broader and that there are many more contributors than those that people think of and those that people praise. And so therefore, it's important for me to unpack that and go a little bit further and let them know that there are some connections, right? So I'll use, for example, the first time I met Ruben Blades in June of 1975, July of 1975 at Finding Records, introduced to him by Ray Barretto. First thing he said to me was, "Where are you from?" I said, "Puerto Rico." He said, "Don't forget to play." And then he gave me a list that included Tito Rodriguez, that included Gran Combo, Rafael Cortijo, Ismael Rivera, Mon Rivera, Joe Cuba, Joe Feliciano. He said, "Don't forget to play these guys because they were the ones that opened the door for me to do what I'm doing as an artist." And so for a Panamanian to tell me that meant to me, okay, so he's been connected, and he gives tribute to Puerto Rican artists as being the ones that opened the door for him to become immersed in this great music of Afro-Cuban, Afro-Latin rhythms. So what that taught me was that there were others outside of the Puerto Rican diaspora, out of the archipelago of Puerto Rico, who understood our music and understood our history and understood our traditions in ways that even Puerto Ricans did not understand. And vice versa, those others, and I'll use that term in the sense people that were not Puerto Rican, taught me a lot about all their music and all the music of their regions, right? So vice versa, Ruben Blades opened the door for me to understand more about Latin America and chronicle the Latin American experience and chronicle the connection between Colombia and Panama. And then that brought me into Venezuela. Then that brought me into Peru. And so all of that opened the door for me to see all these connections and realize that there's a little touch of something in each thing. When you speak with Patricia Zarate, the wife of Danilo Perez, who wrote a great book on jazz and the influence of Panama in the history of jazz, when you speak to her and you speak to Danilo, you realize that the Leon Russells of the world, right, the Frank Andersons of the world, all of these great Panamanian musicians who people assume were North American because A, they were black, so they figured they must be African Americans, and they had these English surnames. They don't realize that they were Panamanian and that they came from the West Indies and other places to Panama, and their ancestors were from those islands and those places. But they contributed so much to the history of jazz, yet North Americans would not put them anywhere in the books of history because they didn't see them as being an important cog, an important contribution to what jazz is today, when in fact they were very much part of this great music that's called jazz. And so for me, it's important to bring all that into what I'm doing as far as the audience is concerned, so that they can see the connections, see the contributions, see the breadth of what we've done, see the deepness of how we've influenced music, and how we are very much part of this movement called the global jazz movement of music that's taken place. You know, when Tomas mentions Miguel Sanon, when Miguel was studying here at Berklee College of Music and I first met him as a freshman, I already knew that we had somebody in our hands that was going to be a superstar. And years later, when he performed with David Sanchez, he was with his band and he did a gig here that I promoted. I was the MC during the first set. Miguel was kicking ass and David was kicking ass even more. And during the intermission, I said, "David, I've never heard you play that well." He says, "It's because of that kid next to me. He's pushing me. He's pushing me to play like I've never played before." And what they were playing was not Puerto Rican music. It was not full Latin music. They were playing some great music that had all these influences. But these two guys up front were both Puerto Ricans and both doing a great job. But they already had embraced the Pan-Latinism of music. They had already embraced the breadth of music writ large that included jazz and every other thing when they were performing. And so for me, it's important, I think, that those who are on the other side may not know this, but if they don't, it's my role then to make sure that at least I introduce them to it. And if they do know it, that it gives them an affirmation. Yes, this is important for me to understand when it comes to appreciating this great music of ours, regardless if you want to call it jazz, Latin jazz, Pan-African, Pan-American jazz, or whatever term you want to give it. It is part of this great artistic expression that all of us are doing and all of us are embracing. And it's important for me, for Latinos in particular, to embrace this, Michael, because I don't want Latinos to always think that we're in a box and this is the only kind of music that we can produce. This is the only kind of rhythms that come from what we do. This is the only kind of tradition that we can call ours, when in fact we've done so many different things and influenced music in so many different ways and continue to do so to this day.
The only box I would describe your programming, it would be like a box of Masso donuts, where every single donut is different and delicious. You know, moving on to structural issues, let's look at the paradox in the room. I mean, Spanish-speaking communities are some of the largest and fastest growing in the U.S., and bilingualism is so present in our society. I live in a community that's 40% Latino. Everything is bilingual. So why then If you look at media, if you look at print media, if you look at radio, bilingualism is heavily adapted throughout U.S. culture. Why not so much within jazz radio and journalism?
I think because they're afraid it doesn't sell. It won't sell. Radio and magazines are always looking at the numbers, right? So you'll see John Coltrane on the cover because he sells. By the way, there was at one time two Latino publications which no longer exist, which actually dedicated themselves strictly to Latino artists. And when I say Latino, I mean pan Latino. It was Danilo Perez. It was Puerto Rico. It was Latin America. Unfortunately, they didn't make it. It was Latin New York Magazine, Latin
Yep.
Beat.
Land B.
Latin Beat was the other one, and they were adventurous publications, but they struggled. They struggled, and the reason I say that is because I know somebody that was, in fact, radio show host Vicky Sola, who
Sure.
had a salsa show for 30 years on WFDU. She was a writer for them, and they struggled financially to stay afloat. There was actually another magazine also that was very good, whose name I can't recall. Yeah, I just think that publishers see it as a niche audience, and they're concerned, and also radio. Having worked in radio briefly, I can tell you that, and I mentioned Vicky Sola because her show was on the air for 30 years. One of the reasons that she survived as long as she did was because she was the one that raised the most money when they had fundraisers. She had a very loyal audience. And of course, because she was on for so many years, she was the top fundraiser for WFDU. Had she not been able to raise that money, I don't know that they would have kept her on air. And in fact, not long ago, they actually cut all Latino programming, went back to playing rock and roll.
I mean, of course, the paradox of this is that the reporting on Latin influence in jazz is very, very small, is not considered to be an influencer. But if we look at the breadth and scope of pan-Latin artists that are changing the landscape of jazz, it's
Absolutely.
enormous. So that only accentuates it. Jose, do you find that the platforms that you tend to promote and the style in which you do bilingual journalism kind of promotes a non-Western centric style of reporting?
For sure.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. But that's on purpose. That's on purpose. And it's on purpose, going back to that narrative that I said, until a lion told the story of the hunter will be always going. I consider myself one of the lions. And so I think in the group of lions that are using this platform, be it radio or be it print, what we're trying to do is give a perspective that's very much our story. And by our, I'm using the OURs, meaning everyone who is living this experience, right? And particularly the musicians and the artists and spoken word artists for contributing in so many different ways. And I think we need to do that because there is a lack of understanding, B, a lack of curiosity, C, a lack of knowledge, and D, a lack of respect with regards to all of this that we contribute. It's like we're the quote unquote other, right?
Yes.
Instead of being the it. We're not considered being part of that ecosystem, even though we're very much part of that ecosystem. And part of it has to do with, unconscious bias. It has to do with misinformation, and has to do with just ignorance, but also has to do with racism and all of the elements that have to do with just this great music of ours that's called jazz. And I think our role then is to be unapologetic of what we do. And so I try to be unapologetic. And I do so speaking truth to power through the music, through the speaking word, and through my own commentary as a way of uplifting and amplifying the contributions of these great artists. And at the same time, being a champion, being a steward for every single one of them, because they deserve the recognition, they deserve the respect. I don't care if it's somebody like a Charlie Sepulveda that Tomas mentioned, or an Arturo Sandoval, or Humberto Ramirez that Tomas mentioned. It doesn't matter who the artist is, at what level they are. There's a Jonathan Suazo, the great saxophonist.
Absolutely.
Another one. When I interviewed Miguel one time, I said, Miguel, who are some of the cats that I should be looking out for? And he said, Edmar Colón and Jonathan Suazo. And sure enough, both of them are stellar musicians, right? And so my role then is to uplift, amplify all of these artists, give them the respect that they deserve, put them at the same pantheon as all of these other great artists that mainstream jazz communities consider to be great artists, make them understand that they are contributing and doing some excellent work in every one of their compositions. Every one of their discs that comes out is a work of art, a magnum opus in my consideration, in my thinking. And so therefore, my role is just to be that champion, be that person who's going to say, this is worthy, let's respect it, Let's give them the admiration that they deserve. Let's give them the accolades that they deserve now while they're alive. And let's make sure that we promote them as much as we can and make them part of just the day-to-day ingredient of the many of opportunities that people have to listen when it comes to radio. And when it comes to reading, I'm with you, Tomas, and I'm with you, Michael. The fact that major magazines, I'll use Downbeat as an example, Jazz Times as an example, they would do, from time to time, they would do their very special editions, et cetera, et cetera. But it should be, every edition should have something related to the contributions and the work of these great artists that we know are doing some great things in the musical world.
And we could apply that to jazz radio programming. I am exhausted by ghettoizing Latin music into a Latin tinge set or one or two programs. I mean, I'm happy to live in a community where actually Pan-Latin artistry is embedded throughout the jazz radio broadcasting dial. I'm glad that you are unapologetic, Jose. I need to apologize for not being a Spanish fluent speaker, because the irony of this podcast is that it's not spoken in both languages. So that paradox is certainly caught up with me. So any final thoughts as we wrap this up? Clearly, I wish we had more time. And there is a lot to unpack with this. We've actually just scratched the surface. So,
well, I just want to say that what Jose just said, I totally agree with. And what he does through his broadcasting is what I try to do through my writing. And that is, lifting up these musicians who deserve to be recognized and who, quite frankly, are marginalized. But everything that Jose said, I totally agree with. That's what I try to do through my writing. And being bilingual is another tool that I can use to highlight, what these musicians are doing, and to bring them to the attention of people that probably normally wouldn't know who they are, or don't know enough about them.
Michael, let me close by saying, let's use Miguel Senón as an example. Miguel is fluent in English and Spanish. He's multicultural in everything he does. He's a reader. He's a student. He's a Renaissance man. Danilo Perez, the same thing. I mentioned Ruben Blades, bilingual, multicultural Renaissance man. So I think that the artists that we speak of, there are different levels. Those who are fluent in every language, or more than one language, more than their own language, I think are the ones who have been able to expand their audience and expand where they go to. That goes back to Eddie Palmieri, it goes back to Tito Puente, it goes back to Ray Barretto, it goes back to Mogo Sanabria, it goes back to all of those iconic figures that we have. So I think that the key for many artists is the ability to code switch, learn and be able to be fluent in the English language speaking, but at the same time maintain their roots. And so when you have, and we're using Miguel Senón as the example, when you have a Miguel Senón who is so clearly identified with his roots in every single production that he does, but expands the envelope in the widest way possible, then you have what I think is the ultimate example of what this music is able to do, right? Maintain, celebrate, honor your roots, but at the same time, open your mind and embrace what the future can bring as far as the kind of music that you're going to share with people. And I think the bilingualism is a key, because the bilingualism turns to multiculturalism, and the multiculturalism then turns to connecting your music to the whole wide world. And that's what jazz programming should be doing, connecting to everyone, not just being a niche, but connecting and opening the door for everyone to enjoy what this great music is, which is the international music.
And a great example of that are two women who are completely taking the jazz world by storm. Okan, Afro-Cuban artists who, what I love is their music is bilingual and completely unapologetic. And not only that, but it can sound like Bad Bunny, and then it can sound like Afro-Cuban folkloric cultures, and then it can be straight ahead jazz. So their fluency is the next generation of mastery. So
I love it. I love it.
Tomas and Jose, thank you so much for such a thoughtful conversation, and a special thanks also to our editor, Wiz Pena. Don't miss new episodes of The Buzz. Make sure you follow us wherever you listen to podcasts. And for more on the Jazz Journalists Association, go to jjanews.org. I'm Michael Ambrosino. Thanks so much for listening.